The stagflation backdrop is one that I think is probably the path of least resistance right now, unfortunately.
Welcome to Wealthion. I'm Wealthion founder Adam Taggart, and I'm trying something a little bit new today. I was chatting with my good friend Stephanie Pomboy, who many of you have seen either interviewed on this channel or stepping into guest host when I've been away. And Stephanie was telling me about some of the reactions that she had to some recent data showing the state of the U.S. consumer. And I basically just said, hey, Steph, rather than just you and I have this conversation privately, why don't we do it publicly for the Wealthion audience? So we're going to try that out here. Stephanie, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Adam. This is always fun.
It's always a pleasure. And it's great that we get to have you this time, as well as Wilhelmina. I see her there in the background.
Well, hopefully she won't snore throughout this entire thing. She doesn't find some of this stuff as fascinating as you and I do. So let me know if I need to nudge her.
Well, as they say, it's a dog's life. If we all could have the life that she does. All right. Well, look, Stephanie, you were beginning to tell me about some of the relatively recent stats you were looking at, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but they seem to be making you perhaps even more concerned about the future prospects for the consumer household.
Yeah, I mean, I guess people may be putting the pieces together on the degree to which inflation has really been the story driving spending. But I think this morning's retail sales report really underscored the point. In July, we had a month with, in theory, 0% inflation, and lo and behold, you get zero growth in retail sales. And what's been going on here is that I think a lot of analysts and certainly investors have mistakenly conflated stronger headline spending and retail sales numbers with consumer strength, when in reality, all it is showing you is inflation. If you've looked at retail sales adjusted for inflation, they peaked last April. Which is noteworthy because at the end of March of last year is when the final stimulus check from the whole COVID extravaganza was spent. So it's almost to the day that the stimulus stopped. You saw this complete 180 in the part of consumer behavior. You also saw it reflected in consumer sentiment, which has dropped 30 points in the ensuing, whatever that is, 14, 15 months. You've also seen, obviously, a U-turn in credit card balances, where people used a lot of their COVID stimulus money to pay down balances, and actually were paying down balances in record fashion. We had never seen them reduce their credit card debt at that pace. And now they've done a complete 180, and we've never seen them increase their credit card balances as rapidly as they have since last April. And obviously at 16.5% interest rates, you have to assume that they're not borrowing on credit cards because they really want to pay that kind of usurious interest rate. It's that they really don't have any option. So I guess, when I step back, I look at this morning's retail sales report and the data in general, and my sense is the consumer isn't nearly as strong as popularly perceived. And then you've got this Federal Reserve that is sort of singularly focused on, obviously, inflation, but also the labor market, which it characterizes as tight because the only number it seems to care about is the payroll report. And you and I could talk about this for an hour, but I think people would fall asleep. The payroll report is probably one of the least reliable statistics, prone to the biggest revisions. Even by the BLS's own admission. I think the confidence interval is like plus or minus 120,000 per month. So, the idea that they can measure these monthly changes in employment is sort of laughable to begin with. But more importantly, as relates to the Fed's posturing right now, the payroll employment is the sole exception out there. It's the only employment indicator that's still signaling strength. Every other employment indicator, whether it's the household survey, unemployment claims, you name it, the employment components of both the manufacturing and non-manufacturing PMIs, the regional Fed surveys, go on and on, NFIB small business hiring plans, every single one of those components has rolled over, and mostly rolled over pretty hard. And yet we've got this Fed that seems to be driving monetary policy, looking through the rearview mirror of payroll employment numbers. So, this just seems to me to be a market that is sort of mischaracterizing, let's say, the strength of the consumer and thinking the economy is strong enough to withstand the Fed rate hikes. And the Fed, meanwhile, thinks the same thing because they're looking at this lagging employment data. And it all seems to me to be a very perilous situation because, rates aren't going to go lower anytime soon, as far as I can tell. And the markets are, just kind of whistling past the graveyard. I'm sorry, I just spewed all that out, but let me know if I should go back and expand on any of those points.
Well, sure. So there's a great parade of points there. And I want to springboard off of the last comment you made here. And our challenge here, Steph, as we talked about, let's have you on and have a quick, 10, 15-minute conversation. You're going to have to control me because I'm going to, going to want to keep digging here with you. But your last point there about, the fundamental data showing that, the consumer continues to weaken and the economy in general continues to weaken, yet the market is partying on, or to use your term there, which I think is accurate, which is sort of whistling past the graveyard here. The Fed, you and I can sling a lot of criticism at the Fed. I do think they are smart enough to have realized over the past several years that they have boxed themselves into a corner, right, where they had blown this massive asset bubble, the everything bubble that everyone's called it, and had held rates for so low for so long that as the economy still continued to slow, that they were finding themselves stuck. Basically, they wouldn't have no wriggle room when the next recession hit. And so now that inflation is giving them the air cover too, but also really forcing them to start raising rates, I do think that Powell and the rest of the Fed probably want to raise hikes as high as they can get away with here, right? So they want to ideally give themselves as much altitude as possible so that they have room to bring rates down again the next time a major recession hits. And you just said, you just recounted a lot of data that says, hey, we may be heading towards recession here. Some people think we may already be there, even though the definition of recession seems to be changing these days. But to your point about the metrics that the Fed is using to, influence its decisions, one, they are retroactive, and two, when they're looking at most for the job side of their, mandate to keep unemployment as low as possible, it's a suspect number, right? You just said it doesn't map to any of the other jobs numbers that we're seeing here. So where I'm going with this is the markets are rallying. The Fed, if it looks at jobs, is saying, well, the job market seems still super robust. And Powell has been saying for months now that his job is basically to try to cool off the jobs market, right? To diminish, to manufacture the demand destruction that he's looking for. So as far as the Fed thinks, looking at those data points, it's probably saying, oh, well, I got plenty of room to keep raising rates higher from here, right? So people that are expecting a Fed pivot or a Fed pause, do you think that they're likely to be disappointed here because the Fed is basically saying, people say the Fed's going to hike until something breaks. The Fed's looking around right now and saying, I don't see anything breaking, market going up, unemployment still near record lows.
Well, this is the irony, is that by rallying, the markets are diminishing the possibility that the pivot that's the basis of the rally actually happens. They're basically they're easing where the Fed is trying to tighten, and that just makes the Fed need to tighten more. So I think that's certainly one interesting facet of this. The other one is this whole pivot narrative. I think, I'm not sure, is it a pivot or do people anticipate a pause? Because it's extremely hard for me to envision the Fed suddenly slashing interest rates like they did in 2018. And it feels like that's what investors are anticipating right now. It's a 2018 style complete reversal. I just, because I'm a nerd, ran a spreadsheet looking at what would happen if the CPI posted zero increases between now and year end. Where would the CPI end the year on a year over year basis? And it would end the year at 5.4% if we have zero prints every single month between now and then, which seems to me highly unlikely. So the point is that the inflation numbers are going to take a long time to get down to anywhere near the realm that the Fed should feel comfortable reversing course. You know, they may pause, but do they rush to cut rates? And if they don't rush to cut rates, then the point is really moot. And I think the point is moot anyway, and that is in this just almost obsessive fixation on how much more the Fed's going to raise rates. The markets have completely ignored the impact of what they've done already. And the fact is, we have never, not even during Volcker, seen an increase in the Fed funds rate of this speed and magnitude. And just a comparison back to that 2018 infamous pivot episode, it turns out that the Fed funds rate went exactly the same distance. It went from 0.25 at the beginning of the rate hike cycle, and it peaked at 2.5%. And that's exactly the path that we've covered so far today. However, in the lead up to the 2018 meltdown, it took the Fed 3 years to take the Fed funds rate up. It took them 4 months this time. So the notion that there isn't some serious distress and dislocations that have been caused by the speed and magnitude of this increase strikes me as just wildly optimistic. And, you know, I'm really focused on the credit market because for me, that's where you're going to see the first signs of distress here. And one thing that's happened in the last month that's been really remarkable in the face of this massive risk on rally is corporate credit ratings have made a complete 180. So you started the year with 2 upgrades for every 1 downgrade. This is all kind of wonky, but I think it matters because as you'll recall from that housing bubble bust, the ratings agencies weren't exactly on top of what was happening. You know, by the time they figured out things needed to be downgraded, the problem was already, you know, full frontal.
Right. It's like your smoke alarm going off after your house has already been reduced to ashes.
Burns out. Right. Exactly. So, so in January, upgrades were outpacing downgrades on a 2-to-1 ratio. In July, that flipped the other direction. So now downgrades are outpacing grades 2-to-1. So this is really a dramatic, swift reversal. It's not surprising because you got to figure if you were a junk rated borrower and you were borrowing at 4% in December and you've got a roll paper at 7.5%, that's going to be a problem, especially against a backdrop of, you know, deteriorating profit margins. And we know there's over $1 trillion in debt that is sort of termed as zombie companies, companies who couldn't service their debts before interest rates went up. So it's just clear to me that there have to be a lot of cracks forming in this credit chain that have yet to really bubble to the surface, but you're starting to see the hints around the edges. Issuance has completely evaporated this year, and obviously the ratings. And we have last week Avaya with, you know, going to have to do debt restructuring. So, you know, things are starting to turn a little sour in the credit market, and then it's just a question of how long that catches up to equities.
All right. Well, let me ask you about that, which is, you know, Hemingway had that great quote about going broke, right? Where it happens gradually and then all at once, right? And that tends to be the nature of sort of exponential trends, and oftentimes economic crisis kind of tends to arrive that way. You have one domino fall, another domino fall, and then a whole bunch fall real quickly as a result of that. So I'm gonna continue our analogizing that we kind of like to do in these discussions. The Fed policy has a lag, right? The Fed pulls a lever and it takes a certain period of time, usually measured in quarters, you know, 3-4 quarters before that's really manifested in the economy. So you just said the Fed really pumped the brakes hard, right? Starting, you know, what, 2 quarters ago or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's while we're seeing some of the evidence of slowdown in the economy that you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, the impact of a lot of that is still yet to be felt, right?
Yes.
And the Fed
Yeah.
may continue hiking rates along the way, right? So there's going to be this rolling thunder in the future of the arrival of the impacts of this. You also talked about how historically fast the Fed has raised rates so far, right? And I've used this analogy a couple of times on this channel. I don't think I've mentioned it to you yet, though, which is the rate of change is really important here. And a way to understand that is Stephanie, if I gave you a gallon of water and gave you a week to drink it, you'd have no problem doing that. But if I just shoved it up against your face and forced it all down your throat at once, you drown, right? And I think that there's an apt analogy in that. And that's sort of what we've done, right, with these historically fast rate hikes, the impact of which hasn't really hit in full yet, right? So we may have kind of like a heart attack moment, for the economy still ahead of us, given what's already happened to date. And like I said, the Fed may continue hiking. So by the time the Fed may continue hiking into this heart attack moment and then realize, oh my gosh, we've totally overslowed the economy. Now we got to reverse course.
Right.
Do you sort of see the danger of what I've just described sort of playing out over the next couple quarters?
Absolutely. I've had this kind of radical thesis about the path of Fed policy since I first started talking about raising rates. And, phooey on me because I ended up getting it wrong. But my idea was that just tapering their balance sheet was going to result in a significant slowdown in the economy, because this is really simple and not a secret. The US economy requires ever expanding amounts of credit to go forward. So if credit creation in 2022 is the same as it was in 2021, the economy will slow. It consumes more credit. It gets worse miles per gallon, let's say, over time, because we pass diminishing marginal returns on each dollar, probably, I would assume, because of each dollar, more and more is going to debt service now
Right.
than productive uses. So anyway, that's sort of the big picture, is that the economy has to get the fuel in the tank, the credit fuel in the tank. And by tapering its balance sheet, basically the Fed was siphoning that fuel. Now it's adding rate hikes on top of that. So to me, the rate hikes, as I said earlier, it doesn't really matter how much they do from here. They've already done too much, in my view. I mean, they're going to really quash growth. I happen to think we're in recession already. And I do think that given the magnitude of rate hikes we've seen so far, we're headed for a repeat of a 2008 type of scenario. But they're also now shrinking their balance sheet. So we've got a combination of factors. And importantly as well, I guess to mention, they're not the only ones. This isn't unique to the US. It's not like the US is tightening and the rest of the world is pumping money into the financial markets, so the liquidity game continues. It's really a global phenomenon. So I guess my feeling is that as to whether or not the Fed might overdo it, I think they already have. And to your point, it's just that we haven't been hit by the 2x4 yet, but it's coming. And going back to the corporate credit thing, I just did an overlay of junk yields versus the speculative grade default rate to figure out, what's the lead time between interest rate increases and how long it takes for the pipeline of defaults to start to, for the defaults to come out the pipeline. And it's 12 months. So the bottom in junk yields was last September, which means in the next month or so, we should start to see that default rate tick up. And maybe that will, act as a little harness on this stock market rally, if people actually pay attention to it, and don't dismiss it as isolated and contained or whatever phraseology we end up using this time around. But yeah, I mean, to answer your point, I think clearly the Fed is going to overdo it. I mean, that's a layup of a bet because that's what they've done every time before. So I'm just going to go with the probabilities here.
All right. Well, look, Stephanie, I promised you that this was going to be a quick conversation. It's already gone on longer than I initially sort of guaranteed you it would. So
I'm a blabbermouth. What can I say?
no. I mean, the challenge is there's so much great material to cover here. And I know a lot of folks are going to scream in the comments, "Hey, Adam, just let her go longer." But the concept here, folks, is, to bring Stephanie on when she sees macro data happening in real time that she wants to, give some color commentary on. If you would like to see us do more of this, as Stephanie sees data that she thinks is worth talking about, let us know in the comment section, and we'll make this a more regular event going forward. Last question for you, Stephanie, before I wrap up. I know in past interviews that we've done, you have a lot of concerns about deflation sort of, being the big worry here in the longer term. But we're likely not going to go from immediately hot inflation to immediate deflation. And it sounds like from what you've said, and I've certainly seen a lot of other data that supports this, that says the CPI, disinflation may be the trend going forward in terms of declining CPI, but it's highly unlikely to drop down anywhere near the Fed's target of 2% anytime soon, just for a lot of mathematical reasons, the numbers of which you just mentioned. It's probably going to be a glide path measured in quarters, maybe even years, before we get quote unquote under control, even if at all. And so it seems to me that the outlook that you seem to be seeing ahead of you for the next half a year even maybe, is one more of stagflation, right? Where economic growth just craters, maybe we go into recession, but prices remain stubbornly high, kind of the worst of both worlds for the average consumer. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, what could get us from 8.5% CPI to zero or negative in a hurry would be asset bubble bust on a par with what we saw in 2008. And I think that's coming. It's just a question of when, is it going to be in the next 3 months? Is it going to be in the next 9 months? I guess that's anyone's guess. But in the meantime, yeah, the math makes the CPI sticky. You'd have to see some real significant asset destruction to cause a reverse wealth effect that really had the demand destruction impact that, ultimately led you, as you did in 2008. You'll recall, the CPI was 5.6%, I think, in June of 2007, and a year later it was -2.1.
Right.
I mean, within 12 months, you went from +5 to -2. That kind of thing isn't outside the realm of possibility, but for the reasons you outlined, I think right now, the math is pretty sticky, and the real fly in the ointment is the energy policy here, which is going to make that component of inflation, which is really critical driver of what we're seeing, really stubborn and hard to remove. So I think the stagflation backdrop is one that I think is probably the path of least resistance right now, unfortunately. We'll see how it plays out, and I would be happy to comment on all the data as it does. So
great. Well, thanks. And look, folks, if you want more Pomboy, again, comment below and tell us you want to see her come on here. But also, she'll be one of the featured speakers along with Grant Williams at Wealthion's online fall conference next month. Again, that's Saturday, September 24th. Though if you can't make the live event, everyone who registers will get replay videos of that. I think you folks have already heard me a couple of times sort of run through the whole incredible faculty list, but Stephanie is definitely a big shining star amongst them. And if you want to learn more about that event, just go to wealthion.com/conference. And if you've enjoyed this discussion here with Stephanie, again, comment below, but also help support this channel and having us have her back on by liking this video and then clicking the red subscribe button below if you haven't already, as well as that little bell icon right next to it. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining us. I hope we can have you back on and do this.
would love to. Thank you so much, Adam, and apologies for Wilhelmina snoring.
No, that's the best part of the discussion.
She had a wild night last night, I guess. So I don't know. So
yeah, like I said, it's a dog's life, huh?
Yeah.
All right. Well, look, thanks so much for doing this, Steph. Again, I hope we get to do it more often going forward. Everybody else, thanks so much for watching.